You know, everyone wonders about inequality, where it comes from.
Yes, big question.
And you want to understand it, but honestly, who has the time to sift through all the dense academic stuff?
Exactly. It can be overwhelming.
So that's what we're doing here. We took a deep dive into this really significant new study for
He
you.
did. It's just out in PNAS,
Yeah.
Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, and it's massive.
Massive how?
They looked at house sizes,
Yeah.
over 50,000 ancient houses.
50,000, seriously.
Yep. From more than 1,000 different archaeological sites all over the world.
Wow.
And covering the last, 10,000 years. Researchers like Gary Feinman at the Field Museum in Chicago were involved. It's a huge undertaking.
Okay, 10,000 years. So the mission here for this deep dive is basically to unpack what all that data tells us. Is inequality just baked in? Does it have to happen as societies grow?
That's the core question, yeah.
Mm.
And we want to look at what factors seem to, push inequality levels up or maybe keep them down historically.
Because I think a lot of us have this idea, right? That, okay, societies get bigger, you get formal leaders, you start farming.
And inequality just inevitably shoots up.
Exactly. Is that what they found?
Well, that's the fascinating part. The study's main conclusion, and it's a pretty big deal, is that high levels of inequality are not inevitable, not even in really large, complex societies.
Not inevitable. Okay.
Their argument is that, human decisions, the kinds of institutions we create, these things can actually change the trajectory. They can modify or level off factors that might otherwise make inequality worse.
So we're not just passengers on some historical train track heading towards more inequality.
That seems to be the message.
Oh.
And Feynman himself said something quite interesting about it.
Oh, yeah.
He said basically that while history doesn't follow just one single straight line for wealth inequality, there are patterns, trends you can see across different times and places.
That's not just random chaos.
Right. It's not just noise or chaos, as he put it. And this really challenges that old way of thinking where we might look at, say, ancient Rome or maybe medieval Europe and think, okay, that's just how human societies work.
Right, using them as the default model for everywhere, always.
Exactly. This global perspective shows things were much more varied. Different paths were taken.
Okay, but practically, how do you measure inequality across 10,000 years and all these different cultures? 50,000 houses is a lot to compare.
It is. Their main method was pretty smart, actually. They used the distribution of house sizes within each site.
House sizes? Why that?
Well, think about it. Housing is pretty fundamental. It's often a major form of wealth, something passed down. And it's something archaeologists can usually measure pretty consistently.
Okay, yeah, I can see that. Bigger house, probably better off, generally speaking.
That's the basic idea. Feynman even mentioned from his own work in Oaxaca, Mexico, that bigger houses there were almost always more elaborate too, better built, maybe special features.
So it's a decent proxy for economic standing, even if it's not perfect.
A pretty good one, yeah. And crucially, it gives them a consistent metric they can use to compare all these incredibly diverse places and times.
All right, so they measure the houses. Then how do they turn that into a number, something they can actually compare statistically?
They used a tool called the Gini coefficient.
Ah, the Gini coefficient. I've heard of that. Often comes up with income inequality today.
Exactly the same principle. It's a score. It goes from 0 to 1.
0 being.
0 means perfect equality.
Really?
So in this case, every single house at the site would be the exact same size, which almost never happens, of course.
Yeah. And 1.
1 would be maximum inequality, like one person has a gigantic mansion and everyone else lives in a tiny hut.
Got it. So closer to 0, more equal distribution of house size. Closer to 1, much more unequal.
Precisely. So they calculated these Gini scores for, I think, over 1,000 sites where they had enough data. And then they started looking for correlations. How did inequality relate to, say, political complexity or population size?
Okay, so testing those big assumptions like, does farming automatically lead to higher Gini scores? Does population growth? What did they find there?
This is where it gets really interesting and kind of turns some common ideas on their head. Those grand narratives, as the study calls them.
You mean the idea that it's a straight line? Domestication, then population boom, then hierarchy, then inequality takes off.
Yeah, that kind of linear progression. Or Malthusian ideas, population pressure inevitably causing problems. The data just didn't show that simple, uniform pattern across regions.
So it wasn't linear?
Not really, no. Regional trends varied a lot. And those factors, farming, population growth, hierarchy, they didn't seem to trigger higher inequality in the same way everywhere, or even consistently.
Okay, let's break that down. What about political complexity? Did societies with more layers of leadership have more inequality?
They look at that. They measure complexity by the number of levels in the settlement hierarchy, like villages reporting to towns, reporting to cities.
Makes sense.
And they did find a weak positive correlation. So on average, more hierarchical societies had slightly higher Giannini scores, but, and this is important,
Yes.
the range of inequality actually got wider as societies became more complex, especially once you hit 3 or more levels of hierarchy.
Wider. So some complex societies had low inequality and others had really high inequality.
Exactly. It wasn't that complexity automatically meant high inequality. It seems like complexity created the potential for higher inequality, but whether that potential was realized depended on other things.
Okay, that's a crucial distinction. Potential versus inevitability. What about population size? Same story.
Pretty similar. Yeah, they ran regressions, statistical tests, and again, found a weak positive link between population size and inequality. But there was huge variability around that trend line.
So bigger populations didn't necessarily mean super high inequality either.
Nope. Lots of variation.
Yeah.
Some large settlements had relatively low inequality, others had high. It wasn't a simple equation.
Fascinating. So if it's not just complexity or population size driving this, what else did they find? You mentioned governance earlier.
Right, governance. This turned out to be really key, and they defined it broadly, basically. All the processes involved in governing, making decisions, enforcing rules.
How did they measure that in ancient societies? That seems tricky.
It is tricky. They didn't have, written constitutions for most of these places.
Right. No C-SPAN archives from 3000 BC.
Huh, exactly. So they relied on regional archaeological experts. These experts looked at the evidence. We do have things related to the political economy.
Like how resources were controlled.
Yeah, or evidence about leadership where there are huge palaces and signs of powerful rulers, and also architecture where public buildings monumental and centralized, or more dispersed.
Okay.
Based on that kind of evidence, the experts coded the governance style along a spectrum, basically from autocratic, meaning highly centralized power.
Like a king or a small elite calling all the shots.
Right. Versus more collective or democratic systems where decision-making was more distributed.
That's a clever approach, using the physical evidence. What did that governance dimension show?
This was really striking. They found that this governance dimension, autocratic versus collective, accounted for roughly the same amount of variation in inequality as the number of hierarchical levels did.
Wow. So how power was wielded was just as important as how layered the society was.
It seems so. They even created a combined variable. They called it hierarchical clout.
Catchy name.
It basically combined the number of hierarchy levels with how autocratic the governance was. The idea was to measure societies that were both highly layered and had power concentrated at the top.
And did that clout correlate strongly with inequality?
Yes, it showed a stronger correlation, especially in the main centers, the apex sites, and where they had larger samples of houses. It really suggests that combination hierarchy plus concentrated power facilitates wealth accumulation for the few.
But crucially, governance could still make a difference even within those complex hierarchical societies.
Absolutely. This is one of the coolest findings. They specifically compared apex sites in complex polities, 3 or more levels, that had autocratic governance versus those with collective governance. And the collectively governed ones often had significantly lower inequality despite being large and complex.
Can you give some examples?
Sure. They pointed to places like classical Athens in Greece, Monte Alban and the massive city of Teotihuacan in Mexico, Tlaxcalan, also in Mexico, Cahokia near modern St. Louis.
Cahokia, right here in North America.
Yep, and even Mohenjo-Daro in the Indus Valley. These were major urban centers, but the evidence suggests more collective governance, and they had lower Gini coefficients for house size compared to many autocratic counterparts.
And the autocratic examples with higher inequality.
Places like Assur in Babylon and Southwest Asia, Chan Chan in Peru, Knossos in Crete. These tended to show more evidence of autocratic rule and often had higher measured inequality.
That's incredibly powerful. It really underscores that structure isn't destiny. The way people organize their power structures mattered immensely.
It really does.
Yeah.
It suggests choices were made that had real consequences for wealth distribution.
Okay, this is reshaping how I think about this. Now, the outline also mentioned something about external resources. How did things like metals or animals fit in?
Right. That adds another layer. They noticed a regional pattern. In those hierarchical, autocratically ruled societies, inequality seemed generally higher in places like Southwest Asia, Europe, and South America compared to Mesoamerica and North America.
Why might that be?
They propose it might relate to the availability of certain kinds of resources, specifically domesticated herd animals like cattle, sheep, goats, and also metals.
What's special about herd animals and metals in this context?
Well, they represent forms of wealth that can potentially be accumulated and controlled by a smaller group of people without necessarily relying on mobilizing massive amounts of labor from the whole population.
Ah, okay. Like a ruler can own vast herds or control access to mines and metal production.
Exactly. It's different from wealth based purely on agricultural land that requires lots of people to work it. They also note that metals showed up later in Mesoamerica, and interestingly, their appearance sometimes coincided with inequality rising in certain centers there.
And herd animals.
Herd animals can also grease the wheels of long-distance trade, moving goods around, which is another avenue through which wealth can become concentrated.
So combine those kinds of easily monopolized resources with an autocratic government.
And you potentially have a recipe for higher inequality. They mentioned Kultepe in Turkey as an example. High inequality seemed autocratic, heavily involved in long-distance trade, likely involving metals and perhaps textiles from animal products.
Contrasting with the more collective places.
In contrast, in places with more collective governance, where maybe funding the state or building monuments relied more on mobilizing community labor, wealth might have been linked differently. They did find some connection between population size and governance style in those cases. If you need everyone's cooperation, maybe collective decision-making is more likely.
This paints such a richer, more complex picture than just societies get bigger, inequality goes up.
Absolutely. The big takeaway is really challenging that idea of a single, uniform, or inevitably progressing path for inequality. History looks a lot more varied.
Different paths, influenced by specific choices and conditions.
Exactly. And human agency, the decisions people and groups made about their institutions, seems to have played a really significant role. We can't just use recent European history, for instance, as a universal template.
So things like farming and settling down, sedentism and domestication, they created the potential for more inequality than you might see in small mobile groups.
Yes, they created the potential, the raw material for accumulation, and then larger settlements, more complex institutions, they sort of raised the ceiling on how much inequality could potentially develop.
But whether society actually hit that ceiling depended heavily on how it was governed.
That seems to be the crux of it. Governance was a key mediating factor. Inequality isn't just a natural byproduct of scale, it's largely socially constructed.
Socially constructed, but in patterned ways, as Feinman said, not just random.
Right. The goal now is to move towards these richer, more context-specific explanations, factoring in human choices, institutions, governance, resources, not just relying on overly simple global models.
This has been really illuminating. So for everyone listening, the big message seems to be, history shows us that high inequality isn't some unavoidable fate.
Definitely not. It's been highly variable. And the way societies have been organized, particularly how power and decision-making were structured, played a massive role in how things turned out.
Which really makes you think about today, doesn't it?
It does. If the past shows us it wasn't inevitable, what does that mean for our present and future? What choices do we have now?
And it highlights that there are historical examples, maybe even blueprints, of complex societies that manage to keep inequality relatively lower. Worth studying those mechanisms more.
For sure. There's still so much to learn about how some societies manage that, what specific institutions worked in what contexts.
It opens up a lot of new questions.
Definitely.
So maybe the final thought to leave everyone with is this. If humanity's deep past shows that extreme inequality isn't predetermined, that it's not just how things have to be, well, what does that tell us about our own ability, our own power to shape a more equitable future today?
That's the question to ponder, isn't it?